A stray dog leads officers into the woods. What they found changed the entire investigation. How will this story unfold? To find out, watch the video to the end. But first, please subscribe to my channel and turn on notifications to get more stories like this. The wind carried a sharp bite as Detective Ryan Carter adjusted the collar of his coat, his boots crunching against the damp pavement of the quiet suburban street. The evening was settling in, the orange hues of sunset fading into the creeping blue of twilight. Another uneventful patrol shift, or so he thought. A bark split through the still air, sharp and urgent. Ryan turned, frowning as he spotted a dog barreling toward him from the far end of the road. Its brown and white fur was matted with dirt, and it moved with a frantic energy, tail stiff, ears pinned back. Ryan barely had time to react before the dog stopped directly in front of him, blocking his path. It barked again, short, insistent. Ryan exhaled, shaking his head. "Sorry, buddy, but I don't have time for this." He stepped to the side. The dog moved with him. Ryan frowned. The dog's eyes wide, alert, desperate, locked onto his, as if pleading with him. Something wasn't right. "Where's your owner?" Ryan asked, glancing around. No tags, just an old, frayed blue collar. The dog whined, stepping closer. Then it bit onto his pant leg, tugging. Ryan's hand went instinctively to his belt, but the dog didn't growl, didn't act aggressive. It just pulled, insistent, desperate. Ryan hesitated. Years on the force had taught him to trust his gut. And right now, his gut told him that this wasn't just some stray dog. He exhaled sharply and pressed the radio at his shoulder. "Dispatch, this is Detective Carter. I have a stray acting strangely on Oak Ridge Drive. Requesting backup before I follow it." A crackle of static. "Copy that, Detective. Units en route." Ryan looked down. "All right, boy. Lead the way." The dog took off instantly, sprinting toward the tree line at the end of the neighborhood. Ryan followed. His pulse quickened as they moved from pavement to uneven dirt, the scent of wet leaves thick in the air. He was heading into the woods. The branches above tangled together, casting long shadows as Ryan moved deeper into the trees. His boots sank slightly into the moist earth, the undergrowth thick with leaves. The dog never slowed. It weaved between the trees with certainty, its tail stiff, its breath quick. It was on a mission. Ryan kept his hand near his holster, every step amplifying the gnawing unease in his gut. Then he heard it, a sound, distant, muffled, a rustling like someone moving. Ryan froze. The dog did too, its ears twitching as it stared ahead, completely still. Ryan's fingers tightened around the grip of his gun. He clicked the radio. "Dispatch, I may have something out here. Tell backup to move fast." "Copy that, Detective." A twig snapped somewhere ahead. Ryan's pulse quickened. The dog took a cautious step forward, then another. Ryan followed, his breath shallow. The clearing opened ahead, and that's when he saw it. A torn piece of fabric, snagged on a broken branch. Dirt disturbed. A trail of footprints leading deeper into the forest. Something had happened here. The dog whimpered, its nose to the ground, then began digging frantically. Ryan felt a chill race down his spine. He stepped forward and stopped. The breath caught in his throat. His stomach turned to ice. Just beneath the disturbed dirt, partially unearthed by the dog's paws, was a hand, pale, motionless. Ryan swallowed hard and pressed his radio. "Dispatch, get forensics out here. We've got a body." The dog whined beside him, stepping back. Ryan looked down at it. It wasn't just some stray. It was a witness. Ryan forced himself to take a slow breath, steadying his nerves. The dog stood beside him, its ears pinned back, tail stiff, watching him with expectant eyes. There was no mistaking what he was looking at. A pale, lifeless hand protruding from the damp earth, fingers curled slightly as if frozen in time. The air felt thick, heavy with the scent of decaying leaves and something else, something more disturbing. He pressed his radio. "Dispatch, I need forensics at my location now. Oak Ridge Woods. We've got a body." Copy that, detective. Units en route. Ryan exhaled, stepping closer. He crouched, using the butt of his flashlight to carefully brush away more of the damp earth. The ground was soft, like it had been disturbed recently. As he uncovered more, the outline of an arm took shape, then the tattered sleeve of a faded blue jacket. His jaw clenched. This wasn't just a discarded body. Someone had buried this person here deliberately, hiding a crime. The dog whined softly, pacing in tight circles, as if urging him to do something, to act faster. Ryan looked at it, his mind racing. How long had the dog been out here? Had it been trying to lead someone to this for days? Weeks? He reached out, brushing the dirt off his hands, then gave the dog a reassuring pat on the head. "You knew," he murmured. "You knew this was here." The dog's ears twitched. It took a step forward, then paused, looking back at him before trotting ahead a few feet into the woods. Stopped, turned, barked once. It wanted him to follow. Ryan hesitated. Backup wasn't here yet. He knew protocol: stay with the body, secure the scene. But something about the dog's behavior pulled at his instincts, the same instincts that had told him to follow it in the first place. He clicked his radio again. "Dispatch. Inform responding units I'm pursuing a lead about 50 yards north of the body. The dog is still leading me." A brief pause. "Understood, detective. Proceed with caution." Ryan followed. The deeper they went, the colder the air felt. The woods were silent now, save for the occasional rustle of leaves beneath his boots. His flashlight flickered as he scanned the surroundings, every shadow stretching longer, every sound magnified. He kept his hand near his holster, the weight of his gun a familiar reassurance. The dog moved with purpose, weaving through the trees, pausing just enough to make sure Ryan was still behind. Then a sound, soft, faint, a whimper. Ryan's heart pounded. The dog's ears perked up, and it broke into a run. Ryan followed, his breath coming faster now, adrenaline surging through him. The trail led to a small clearing, overgrown with wild brush. His flashlight beam swept over the area, searching, his pulse roaring in his ears. Then he saw it, nestled beneath a thick cluster of branches, half hidden under a tattered blanket, was a child. Ryan froze. A little girl, no older than 6, curled in on herself, trembling, her face barely visible beneath strands of tangled blonde hair. Her small frame shivered violently, and her arms clutched the dog's fur like it was the only thing keeping her anchored to reality. Ryan moved carefully, lowering himself onto one knee. "Hey, sweetheart," he said gently, his voice softer than he even realized. "It's okay. You're safe now." The girl didn't respond. The dog whined, licking her hand, nudging her gently. Ryan's throat tightened. How long had she been here? Had she been alone this whole time, with only this dog protecting her? His hands moved instinctively to his radio. "Dispatch, this is Carter. I have a live child. I repeat, a live child. Female, approximately 6 years old. Unresponsive but breathing. Request immediate medical assistance." The response was immediate. "Understood, detective. EMS en route. Stay with her." Ryan set his flashlight aside, slowly reaching out a hand. "It's okay, sweetheart. You're safe now. We're going to get you home." The girl flinched, shrinking further into herself. Ryan's heart clenched. He could see the streaks of dirt on her face, the hollow look in her sunken eyes. She had been out here far too long. He looked at the dog. The pieces started to fall into place. The way it had led him here, the way it had refused to leave her side. "You've been protecting her, haven't you?" Ryan murmured. The dog licked the girl's hand again, then looked at Ryan. It understood. Ryan felt a lump form in his throat. He had seen a lot in his years as a detective. Cases that made him question the worst of humanity. Cases that left him awake at night, staring at the ceiling, wondering how people could be so cruel. But this was different. This wasn't just about a crime. This was about a dog who refused to give up. A dog who had stayed, kept this little girl alive when the world had abandoned her. Ryan reached for his coat, shrugging it off before draping it gently over the child's frail body. "I've got you," he whispered. The girl didn't move, but she didn't pull away either. That was enough. A rustling behind him signaled the arrival of backup. Flashlights cut through the darkness, voices calling out. "Over here!" Ryan shouted. Within moments, officers and paramedics swarmed the clearing, securing the area, tending to the girl. Ryan stepped back as they carefully lifted her onto a stretcher, wrapping her in blankets. He watched as her tiny fingers still clutched the dog's fur, refusing to let go. One of the paramedics turned to him. "She's dehydrated, malnourished, but she's alive. That dog." He glanced at the stray still standing beside the stretcher. "Probably saved her life." Ryan nodded, exhaling a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. As they prepared to move the girl, the dog started to follow, ears twitching with uncertainty. Ryan moved before anyone else could stop it. He knelt down, placing a firm but gentle hand on the dog's head. "You're coming with us," he said quietly. The dog didn't resist. It had never left her side before. It wasn't about to start now. Ryan stood, watching as they carried the little girl away, the dog trotting beside them, ever watchful, ever loyal. And in that moment, he knew this case wasn't just about justice anymore. It was about something deeper, something unbreakable. The bond between a lost child and the stray who refused to leave her behind. And Ryan would make sure they were never separated again. The flashing red and blue lights painted streaks across the tree trunks as the paramedics carried the little girl toward the waiting ambulance. The officers stood back, their radios crackling with updates, their voices low, heavy with the weight of what they had just uncovered. The girl had been missing for weeks, her face plastered across flyers, her name repeated in desperate news reports. And yet no one had found her. No one except this dog. Ryan watched as the paramedics worked quickly, checking the girl's vitals, wrapping her in warm blankets. But even as they laid her down on the stretcher, her small, dirt-streaked fingers refused to let go of the dog's fur. The dog sat beside her, unmoving, his body tense, his watchful eyes darting between the strangers surrounding her. He wasn't growling, wasn't panicking, but he was ready to defend her, to keep doing what he had done for God knows how long. Ryan stepped forward. The other officers hesitated, exchanging glances. They saw it too. This wasn't just some stray. This was her protector. "Let him ride with her," Ryan said, his voice firm. Paramedic frowned. "Detective, I don't think..." Ryan didn't let him finish. "She won't let go of him. That dog's the reason she's alive. I'll take responsibility." There was a long pause, then a slow nod. "All right," the paramedic relented. "He stays." Ryan turned to the dog, crouching down in front of him. "Hear that, buddy? You're coming too." The dog's ears twitched, but he didn't move until the stretcher started rolling. Then instinct kicked in. He followed, stepping carefully into the ambulance, never once looking away from the little girl. Ryan exhaled as the doors shut behind them. The vehicle pulled away, its sirens cutting through the quiet night. He stood there for a moment, watching the lights disappear down the road. Then he turned back to the woods, because now he had another job to do. The scene had changed in the past hour. More officers had arrived. The forensic team was combing through every inch of the wooded area, cameras flashing as they documented the shallow grave where they had found the body. The coroner was carefully extracting the remains, a process that never got any easier to witness. Ryan walked toward the lead investigator, Detective Sam Torres, who was studying the disturbed dirt near the grave. "We got an ID yet?" Ryan asked. Torres shook his head. "Not officially, but," he exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "We're pretty sure it's him." Ryan's stomach tightened. Him. The man they'd been chasing for months. The one they believed had taken the little girl. And now he was dead. Ryan let out a slow breath, glancing toward the forensic team. They were carefully bagging evidence, clothing, a wallet, a knife with dried blood on the handle. "Looks like someone got to him before we did," Torres muttered. Ryan's gaze drifted toward the woods, the path the dog had led him down. He didn't need to say it out loud. They were all thinking the same thing. The dog. Had he done this? Had the stray somehow fought back? Ryan ran a hand over his face. It was possible. A desperate man, an animal protecting a child. The pieces fit, but they had no way of knowing for sure. Not yet. All they knew was that the bad guy was in the ground, and the little girl was alive. For now, that was enough. At the hospital, Ryan sat in a stiff plastic chair outside the little girl's room, his fingers drumming lightly against his knee. The dog, who still had no official name, was curled up beside the door, his head resting on his paws, his ears twitching at every sound. They were waiting for the doctors to finish their evaluation, waiting for social services, waiting for answers. Ryan glanced down at the dog. "You've been through a lot, huh?" The dog didn't respond, of course, but his eyes, those sharp, knowing eyes, flickered up toward Ryan for a brief moment before settling back on the floor. Ryan sighed, leaning back. "Me too, buddy." A nurse walked past, pausing when she saw the dog. "He hasn't moved since they brought her in," she murmured. Ryan nodded. "He won't." She smiled softly. "I think she knows that." Ryan followed her gaze to the hospital bed inside the room. Through the glass window, he could see the little girl lying beneath layers of blankets, and 4 drip attached to her tiny arm. She looked so small, so fragile, but she was alive, and she wasn't alone. Ryan's radio crackled, breaking the silence. He pressed the button. "Carter." Tora's voice came through. "You still at the hospital?" "Yeah." "Any updates?" "Just confirmation. It's him. The suspect. The body we found." Ryan inhaled. "Cause of death?" There was a pause. "Still waiting on a full report, but looks like an animal attack. A dog." Ryan's fingers tightened around the radio. He looked at the dog beside him. The dog who had stayed. The dog who had saved her. The dog who had done what no one else could. Ryan exhaled. Understood. He turned off the radio and sat in silence. And in that moment, he knew he wasn't letting this dog go. Because this wasn't just any stray. This was a hero. Ryan sat in the hospital chair, arms crossed, his gaze drifting between the sleeping child and the dog curled up on the floor. The hospital buzzed with quiet activity. Nurses walking past, hushed conversations happening at the nurses' station. But inside this small room, time felt frozen. The girl hadn't woken up yet. And the dog? He hadn't moved from his spot. Ryan sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. He had seen loyalty before, partners on the force who would take a bullet for each other, families who never left their loved ones' sides in the worst of circumstances. But this was something else. The dog had protected her. Had he been with her since the moment she was taken? Had he fought to keep her safe from the man who had stolen her away? And when that man was dead because of him, had he stayed waiting, knowing she needed him? Ryan didn't know how long they had been in those woods together. But one thing was certain. The dog had never left her side. And he never would. A soft rustling made Ryan look up. The girl stirred beneath the hospital blanket, her fingers twitching slightly before her eyes fluttered open. For a moment, she just stared at the ceiling, unfocused, confused. Then her body tensed, her breathing quickened, her small hands clutching at the sheets. Panic. Ryan stood immediately, stepping closer but keeping his movements slow. Hey, it's okay," he said, his voice calm, steady. "You're safe." Her wide, fearful eyes darted to him, her little body coiling in on itself, like she was expecting something terrible. Ryan's heart clenched. Before he could say anything else, the dog lifted his head, ears perking up. And then he moved. He rose to his feet and walked to the bed, his paws making no sound against the tile. Gently, carefully, he pressed his nose against her arm. The girl froze. Then, her hands reached out, grabbing onto his fur, gripping it tight. The dog stood there, letting her hold him, letting her shake, letting her cry without making a sound. Ryan swallowed hard, blinking against the lump in his throat. "That's your friend, huh?" he murmured. The girl didn't look at him. She just buried her face into the dog's fur, and for the first time since she had been found, she exhaled, like she could finally breathe. Ryan nodded slowly. All right, he wouldn't push her to talk. Not yet, but she wasn't alone. She had him, she had the dog, and that was enough. Hours passed. The girl ate a little, just some soup, but it was something. She let the nurses check her vitals, though she flinched at every unfamiliar touch. But she never let go of the dog. Ryan watched everything unfold, arms crossed, mind working through every possible angle of the case. Torres had called again, confirming the forensics report. The suspect had been dead for days before they found him. And based on the evidence, it wasn't just a wild attack. The dog had been defending someone, defending her. Ryan exhaled, running a hand over his face. He glanced at the dog, who now lay beside the bed, watching the little girl with quiet, steady patience. All right, buddy, Ryan muttered. Guess I need to get you a name. The dog flicked an ear but didn't move. Ryan thought for a moment, then smirked. How about Guardian? A beat of silence. Then, as if he understood, the dog thumped his tail once against the floor. Ryan chuckled. Yeah, that fits. The girl finally looked at him, just for a second. Then she lowered her gaze and whispered something into the dog's fur. Ryan didn't catch it, but Guardian did, and that was all that mattered. Ryan didn't leave the hospital that night. He should have gone home, should have gotten some rest, but every time he thought about walking away, something held him back. Instead, he stayed outside the little girl's room, watching over her the way Guardian did. The dog hadn't moved from her bedside. Not once. Every time a nurse came in to check her vitals, every time the hospital staff walked past, Guardian's eyes never wavered from the girl. He was ready to defend, ready to protect. Even though she was in a warm hospital room now, even though she wasn't alone anymore, Guardian wasn't taking any chances. Ryan understood that. He had seen people form deep bonds before, had watched victims cling to those who had saved them, had witnessed the raw, unspoken connection that trauma often created. But there was something different here. This wasn't just a stray dog who had found a lost child. This was a soldier who had fought for her, and now she was his world. Ryan sighed, rubbing a hand over his face. He needed more answers. He needed to talk to her. Morning came slowly. The hospital was quieter than usual, the early hours stretching into the dull light of dawn. Ryan sat at the foot of the bed, watching the little girl as she traced her fingers through Guardian's fur. She was awake but silent, her small hands shaking slightly as she stroked the dog's coat. Ryan leaned forward. "Hey, sweetheart." She stiffened but didn't look at him. Ryan kept his voice soft. "My name's Ryan. I'm a detective." He hesitated, then added, "I want to help you." She didn't answer. Guardian let out a quiet huff and shifted closer to her. Ryan watched her closely, noting the way she pressed into Guardian's warmth, as if the dog was the only thing tethering her to reality. "You've been really brave," Ryan said after a moment. "I know it's scary, but you're safe now." Still nothing. Ryan sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. This was going to take time. But then a whisper, so faint, so soft, he almost missed it. "His name isn't Guardian." Ryan straightened. He hadn't expected her to talk. Not yet. He studied her small frame, the way her hands curled into Guardian's fur like she was drawing strength from him. "What's his name?" Ryan asked gently. The girl swallowed, then whispered, "Charlie." Ryan nodded slowly. "Charlie," he repeated, letting the name settle. Guardian Charlie lifted his head at the sound of his name, as if recognizing it after being lost to time. The girl finally turned her head, just slightly, just enough to meet Ryan's gaze for the first time. And in that moment, Ryan knew this wasn't just about solving a case anymore. This was about healing. For both of them. Ryan held her gaze, careful not to push too hard, not to make her retreat back into silence. The name she had whispered, Charlie, felt like a small bridge, a fragile connection between her world and his. He glanced at the dog. Charlie. For weeks, maybe even longer, this animal had been her guardian, her protector, her only companion in a nightmare no child should ever have endured. And now, sitting beside her in the quiet hum of a hospital room, Ryan understood that this bond wasn't just about survival. It was about trust. Charlie had been the only one to earn it. Ryan leaned back in his chair, keeping his tone light. "Charlie, huh? That's a strong name." The girl hesitated, then nodded just once. Ryan smiled. "I like it. Fits him." He watched her fingers move slowly through the dog's fur, watched the way Charlie stayed perfectly still, as if knowing his very presence was the only thing keeping her grounded. After a moment, Ryan asked, "Did you name him?" The girl's lips parted slightly, her breath uneven. Then, she shook her head. "No," she whispered. Ryan frowned slightly. "Someone else did?" She nodded, eyes still downcast. The room felt smaller suddenly, the air heavier. Ryan had been waiting for this moment, the moment when her past would slip through the cracks of silence. He kept his voice steady. "Who named him? Sweetheart?" The girl blinked rapidly, her small hands clenching slightly in Charlie's fur. Then, she said something that made Ryan's stomach drop. "My brother." Ryan's breath hitched. Brother. He hadn't been prepared for that answer. The case files had said nothing about a sibling, nothing about anyone else missing with her. Ryan sat forward, pulse quickening. "Your brother," he swallowed. "Was he with you?" A pause. Then, her tiny, fragile voice again, barely audible, but heavy enough to break something deep inside him. "He told Charlie to take care of me." Ryan clenched his fists beneath the table, because he already knew. He knew before she even finished her sentence. Her brother wasn't coming home. The following days moved in slow, careful steps. The girl, her name was Lena, spoke in pieces, revealing fragments of what had happened. Not all at once, not in any way that made it easy to understand. But Ryan had spent years piecing together the broken, and he listened to every word. She and her brother had been taken together. The man, the one they had found in the shallow grave, had held them both in that cabin deep in the woods. Ryan could only imagine the terror they had endured. But at some point, things had changed. Her brother had realized something, that no one was coming for them. And so, he did the only thing he could. He made a choice. Ryan didn't need the details to know what had happened next. Somehow, the boy had set Charlie free, had told him to protect Lena, to get her out, and Charlie had listened. The dog had fought, had led Lena away, had kept her alive in the cold, in the dark, in the endless terror of those woods. Charlie had done what no one else had been able to do. He had saved her. Ryan sat with that knowledge, the weight of it pressing against his ribs. The brother had sent Charlie to protect Lena, but he had never made it out himself. Lena wouldn't speak about her brother after that. Ryan didn't push. She had given enough of her past to the world for now. What mattered was that she was here, alive, and Charlie was still by her side. The day she was released from the hospital, social services came to speak with Ryan. There was a long discussion about where she would go, who would take care of her. Ryan listened. He knew the system well. Foster homes, temporary guardians, a life of uncertainty. But as he watched Charlie walk beside Lena down the hospital hallway, never straying, never leaving, always her shadow, he knew there was one thing that wasn't uncertain. They belonged together, and Ryan wasn't about to let them be separated. Weeks later, after exhausting every legal avenue, after fighting through bureaucracy, through endless paperwork, through court approvals and social worker meetings, Ryan Carter signed the final document that made Lena his daughter. And Charlie? Charlie was family, too. The day they walked into their new home together, Lena's small fingers curled around Ryan's hand, her other buried deep in Charlie's fur. Ryan squeezed gently, looking down at her. "You ready, kiddo?" She didn't answer. She just nodded. Charlie trotted inside first, tail wagging slightly. For the first time, they had a home. A real one. A safe one. Together. Ryan let out a slow breath, feeling something settle deep in his chest. Somehow, in the most unexpected way, they had all saved each other. And that was enough. It would always be enough. The house was quiet. save for the soft tapping of Lena's small feet against the hardwood floor. Ryan sat at the kitchen table, a cup of coffee in his hands, watching her explore her new home. She moved slowly, cautiously, as if afraid that at any moment, someone might tell her she wasn't allowed to be here. Charlie followed her closely, his tail wagging slightly but his body alert, as if he still expected danger to lurk around every corner. Ryan had seen this kind of hesitation before, not just in kids but in adults who had been through too much, who had lost their sense of security. It was the same way soldiers moved when they came back from war. Slow, careful, like they weren't sure how to exist in a world that was supposed to be safe. Lena hesitated by the couch, her fingers grazing the fabric. "You can sit," Ryan said gently. She flinched slightly at his voice, then nodded, lowering herself onto the couch as if testing its solidity. Charlie jumped up beside her, circling twice before settling down, resting his head on her lap. Ryan leaned forward. "Do you like it here?" Lena didn't answer right away. Her fingers curled into Charlie's fur. Then, after a long pause, she gave the smallest nod. Ryan exhaled, relief flooding through him. He knew this wouldn't be easy. He knew there would be good days and bad ones, moments of silence and moments of nightmares. But he had made a promise, to himself, to her, to the dog who had saved her. They weren't going anywhere. Lena was home, and for the first time in a long, long while, she knew it too. The first real test came that night. Ryan had tucked Lena into bed, had turned off the lights except for the small nightstand lamp, had even left the door cracked open so she wouldn't feel trapped. But at exactly 2:13 a.m., he woke to the sound of muffled cries. Ryan was out of bed in seconds. He moved quickly down the hall, stopping just outside Lena's room. The sight nearly broke him. She was curled into herself, her small body trembling beneath the blankets, silent tears streaking her face. Charlie sat beside her, pressing his body against her side, his head nudging her gently. Ryan didn't hesitate. He walked in and sat on the edge of the bed, close but not too close. "Bad dream?" he asked softly. Lena nodded, barely breathing. Ryan rested his arms on his knees. "Do you want to talk about it?" She shook her head quickly, clutching a fistful of Charlie's fur. Ryan didn't push. Instead, he sat there, silent, letting the night settle around them. After a moment, Lena spoke, so quietly he almost didn't hear her. "He told me not to be scared." Ryan's chest ached. She didn't have to say who he was. Her brother. Ryan nodded slowly. "He sounds like he loved you a lot." Lena sniffled. "He did." Charlie licked her hand gently, offering comfort in the only way he knew how. Ryan ran a hand through his hair. "You know, sometimes when people love us, they don't really leave us." "Not completely." Lena finally looked at him, her big, teary eyes searching his face. "Where do they go?" she whispered. Ryan exhaled. He didn't have a perfect answer. He never did. But he had spent his whole life believing that love doesn't just disappear. Sometimes, he said slowly, they stay in the people who love them back. Lena blinked. Ryan offered a small smile. "I think your brother is still here." He tapped a gentle finger against her chest, right above her heart. "And I think he's in Charlie, too." Lena stared down at the dog, her fingers tracing his collar. After a long moment, she whispered, "He told Charlie to take care of me." Ryan nodded. "And Charlie listened." Charlie gave a soft huff, resting his chin on Lena's lap. For the first time since she woke up, Lena breathed a little easier. Ryan patted her blanket. "Try to get some sleep, kiddo." She hesitated, then whispered, "Will you stay?" Ryan's throat tightened. "Yeah," he murmured. "I'll stay." He leaned back in the chair beside her bed, watching as Lena's small fingers curled into Charlie's fur. She drifted off slowly, the tension in her face easing, her breathing becoming steadier. And Ryan stayed awake, watching over both of them, because for the first time in his life, he had something worth protecting. The following days settled into a quiet, hesitant routine. Lena was still wary of the house, of Ryan, of anything unfamiliar. She moved carefully, as if expecting everything to change in an instant, as if her safety was temporary. But Charlie was constant. Wherever Lena went, he followed. If she sat on the couch, Charlie curled up beside her. If she wandered the yard, Charlie stayed within a few feet, watching, guarding. He never let her feel alone. Ryan noticed that she never spoke much during the day. But at night, when the house was dark and quiet, when she thought no one was listening, he would hear her whisper to Charlie. Soft words, half sentences, secrets only the dog would understand. Ryan didn't interrupt. She needed that. And Charlie understood. One afternoon, Ryan found Lena sitting on the front porch, her legs tucked beneath her, watching the road beyond the fence. Charlie lay beside her, his head resting on his paws. Ryan stepped outside, letting the door creak slightly to announce his presence. "What you looking at?" Lena shrugged. Ryan walked over and lowered himself onto the step beside her. "You ever lived in a house like this before?" Lena shook her head. "We had an apartment," she said quietly. Ryan glanced at her. That was the first personal thing she had volunteered without being asked. He kept his tone casual. "Did you like it?" She hesitated, then nodded. "We had a balcony." Ryan smiled. "That's cool." Lena traced a small pattern on the porch wood. "Charlie used to sit on it with us. He liked watching cars go by." Ryan looked at the dog. "Yeah, that true, bud?" Charlie flicked an ear. Lena's lips almost twitched into a smile. Ryan leaned back. "Well, I don't have a balcony, but I've got a backyard. Maybe Charlie can keep watch from there now." Lena was quiet for a moment. Then, so softly he almost didn't hear her, she whispered, "Maybe." Ryan smiled. Progress. That evening, Ryan cooked dinner, nothing fancy, just grilled cheese and tomato soup. He wasn't a great cook, but it was warm, simple. He set a plate in front of Lena at the kitchen table. She hesitated, looking between him and the food. Ryan didn't push. He just sat across from her, taking a bite of his own sandwich. "Not bad, huh?" Lena picked up half of her sandwich, holding it in both hands. She stared at it for a long moment before taking the smallest bite. Ryan pretended not to notice how cautious she was, how she still ate like someone who wasn't sure when their next meal would come. But when she finished half her sandwich, he caught Charlie's tail wagging. The dog had been watching her eat. His body relaxed in a way that told Ryan he was relieved. Ryan swallowed the lump in his throat. Charlie wasn't just protecting her physically. He was looking after her in ways Ryan hadn't even thought about. He set his plate down. "You know, you can tell me if there's something else you'd rather eat," he said. "I'm not a great cook, but I take requests." Lena glanced up at him. "Pancakes," she murmured. Ryan raised a brow. "Pancakes." She nodded, then quickly looked down again, as if regretting saying anything at all. Ryan smirked. "All right, kiddo. Pancakes tomorrow." Charlie let out a quiet huff, as if approving the plan. And for the first time, Lena let out a small, hesitant laugh. The next morning, Ryan kept his promise. Lena sat at the kitchen table, Charlie at her feet, as Ryan attempted to make pancakes. Attempted being the key word. Ryan flipped the first pancake, only to have it land awkwardly, half folded over itself. He sighed, poking at it with the spatula. "Okay, so maybe I'm not as good at this as I thought." Lena watched, her small hands wrapped around a glass of milk. Charlie lifted his head, sniffing the air. Ryan tried again, this time managing to get a decently round pancake onto the plate. He slid it in front of Lena with a triumphant smirk. "There. Not too bad, right?" Lena studied the pancake, then glanced up at him. "It's lopsided." Ryan laughed. "Yeah, well, perfection is overrated." She hesitated, then picked up her fork and took a bite. Ryan watched closely but casually, not wanting to make her uncomfortable. He had learned over the past few days that Lena didn't like being observed too much. She ate slowly, carefully, like she was still adjusting to the idea that food was something she didn't have to ration. Charlie let out a small huff beneath the table, as if approving. Ryan exhaled. Another small win. "All right," he said, leaning back in his chair. "What's next on your list of food requests?" Lena hesitated. then murmured, "Mac and cheese." Ryan grinned. "Now that I can actually make." Charlie wagged his tail, and for a brief second, Ryan swore he saw the tiniest flicker of a smile on Lena's face. Later that afternoon, Ryan found her sitting on the living room floor, her fingers idly combing through Charlie's fur. She wasn't speaking to him, not in full sentences, but she whispered to Charlie. It had become her comfort. Ryan sat on the couch, pretending to read the newspaper but listening, waiting for her to let him in. "You think he's okay?" she whispered to Charlie. The dog shifted slightly, pressing closer to her. Lena exhaled. "I hope so." Ryan lowered the newspaper. "Who are you talking about?" Lena tensed immediately, her body going stiff. Ryan didn't push, but Charlie did. The dog let out a quiet whimper and nudged her hand. Lena blinked quickly, wiping at her face with the sleeve of her shirt. "My brother," she whispered. Ryan set the newspaper aside. "You miss him?" She nodded. Ryan's chest tightened. He had no siblings, but he understood loss. He understood what it meant to wake up one day and realize someone you love isn't coming home. "I think he'd be proud of you," Ryan said. Lena swallowed hard. "Why?" Ryan smiled gently. "Because you're strong." Lena looked down at Charlie. "I don't feel strong." Ryan leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "Being strong doesn't mean you don't feel scared, kiddo. It means you keep going even when you are." She didn't say anything, but Ryan saw it, the way her hands stopped shaking just a little. And Charlie? Charlie curled up beside her, pressing his nose against her side, as if to remind her she wasn't alone. As the days turned into weeks, the house slowly began to feel less like a temporary shelter and more like a home. Lena still had her quiet moments, still flinched at unexpected sounds, still hesitated before trusting too much. But she was opening up in small ways, in careful steps. And Charlie? Charlie remained her constant. One afternoon, Ryan walked into the living room to find Lena sitting on the floor with Charlie sprawled out beside her. A pencil and a sketchbook lay open in her lap. Ryan tilted his head. "What are you drawing?" Lena's fingers tightened around the pencil. "Nothing." Ryan smirked. "That doesn't look like nothing." She hesitated, then slowly turned the sketchbook around. It was Charlie. His fur shaded in light strokes, his deep eyes perfectly outlined, the curve of his ears slightly lopsided but still undeniably him. Ryan blinked. "Wow, that's really good." Lena shrugged, but he could tell she was proud. Ryan tapped the corner of the page. "Can I keep this?" Lena's eyes widened slightly. "Why?" Ryan smiled. "Because it's special." Lena glanced at Charlie, then at the drawing. She hesitated, then carefully tore the page from the sketchbook and handed it to him. Ryan took it as if it were the most valuable thing in the world. And maybe, in a way, it was. That evening, after dinner, Lena sat at the table, fidgeting with her fork. Ryan noticed immediately. Something was on her mind. "You okay, kiddo?" he asked. Lena bit her lip, then whispered, "Do I have to leave?" Ryan stilled. His chest tightened. She hadn't asked this before. Not directly. Ryan set his fork down. "Do you want to leave?" Lena shook her head instantly. "No." Ryan swallowed hard. "Then you're not going anywhere." Lena hesitated. "But what if they don't let me stay?" Ryan exhaled, leaning forward so she could see the sincerity in his eyes. "They will," he promised. She studied his face, searching for any hint of doubt. She didn't find any, and for the first time, she let out a breath like she actually believed it. Charlie thumped his tail against the floor, as if confirming it, too. Weeks later, the adoption was finalized. Ryan hadn't expected it to feel so big, so life-changing. But when he signed the last document, when Lena's name was officially written beside his, he realized he wasn't just her guardian anymore. He was her father. When they walked out of the courthouse, Ryan crouched beside her, ruffling Charlie's fur. "Well, kiddo," he said, "looks like we're stuck together." Lena looked up at him, then did something she had never done before. She wrapped her arms around him. Ryan froze for a split second, then hugged her back, swallowing the lump in his throat. Charlie jumped up, tail wagging wildly, as if sensing the moment. Ryan chuckled. All right, you're part of this too, buddy. Lena pulled back, her eyes bright. She reached for Charlie, running her fingers through his fur. Charlie, we're a family now, she whispered. The dog licked her hand, his tail still wagging. Ryan stood, exhaling. Come on, let's go home. And for the first time, it really was home. Together, forever.